Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I built my life on rules and discipline 30 years in aviation, where nothing crossed a line without clearance. Yet in my own home, that line was crossed. My daughter-in-law filled Instagram with croissants and papayas, tagged luxury living and blessed life, while my emergency fund bled $55,000 into her Maldives dream. I sat at my kitchen table holding the cracked china cup my late husband gave me, realizing betrayal does not always roar. Sometimes it hides behind a smile for strangers online. The kettle began to hum on the small stove, and I waited until the thermometer on the counter reached 198 degrees. I had kept that habit from the days when timing and precision ruled my life in aviation safety. Even in retirement, I still measured mornings in rituals. The faint scent of black tea leaves rose as I spooned them into the pot, the steam curling up like threads of memory. From the living room, I heard the muffled sound of a voice carried through the thin walls of our apartment in Capitol Hill. It was V. She spoke quickly, her tone bright, almost rehearsed. I had no intention of eavesdropping, but the apartment was too small and her voice too full of excitement. She said it like a punchline. Maldives trip and flights paid. She laughed in that way people laugh when they want the world to hear. My hand paused on the porcelain teacup, the one Rob had given me on our 25th anniversary. The sound of her laughter made the cup tremble slightly against the saucer. I stood at the counter, the kettle whistling, my body suddenly aware of a chill that had nothing to do with the Pacific Northwest spring air. My chest tightened as though I had been pushed back into a cockpit during turbulence. I stared at the cup, forcing myself to breathe, but the echo of her words would not leave. Maldives paid. I carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat down slowly. My fingers traced the small crack at the base of the china, a fracture I had never been able to throw away. The tea tasted bitter and thin. I tried to tell myself that perhaps I had misunderstood. Perhaps she meant something else, but her laughter made it clear. An hour passed in silence. Jay was not home yet, and V had stepped out to run errands, her perfume lingering in the hallway. I turned the laptop on. The familiar screen glowed to life, and I typed in the credentials I knew by heart. The emergency fund account had been untouched for years, a place for worst-case scenarios, never for indulgence. The numbers appeared, and for a moment I could not process them. Negative 55,000. The red digits glared back at me, steady and merciless. My breath stopped. The room tilted slightly, not from anger, but from clarity. I closed my eyes and saw the hours Rob and I had spent talking about this account. He wanted me to feel safe after his heart failed in 2018. He wanted me to know there would always be something to fall back on. Now that safety was gone. My hands shook as I scrolled through the transactions. Each line was a cut. A luxury travel agency in Miami, business class airfare, a private villa. Every expense tied to the very words I had heard from V that morning. Maldives paid. The knot in my chest grew heavier. I pushed the laptop away and gripped the edges of the table. The wood felt rough under my palms. My thoughts spun in short bursts. Jay had helped me set up this account years ago after Rob died. He said it would make things easier if my health ever failed, if I ever needed someone to access funds quickly. I remembered his soft voice telling me it was just precaution. That memory turned sharp now. The same access had become a weapon. I stood and walked to the sink, rinsing the cup that was still half full. The water ran over my hands, hot but numbing. Out the window, the gray sky of Seattle hung low planes lined up in the distance as they prepared to land. I had lived long enough around aircraft to find their patterns comforting. They followed rules. They did not cross lines without clearance. People should have been the same. I leaned against the counter, staring at the damp streaks of water on my hands. My heart did not race with rage. Instead, it slowed steady and cold. Something inside me began to settle like a steel beam locked into place. This was not a misunderstanding. This was theft, deliberate and planned. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic from the street below. I walked back to the table, opened the laptop again, and stared at the numbers one more time. -55,000. I whispered the number to myself as if saying it aloud would make it real. The silence pressed against me sharp and heavy. I closed the laptop gently and placed both hands flat on its lid. The tea kettle sat empty on the stove, a faint ring of steam still clinging to the spout. I did not cry. My eyes stayed dry, my body held still, as if every tear had been locked behind a dam. The betrayal was not only in the money, but in the audacity of it, the certainty that I would not notice or would not fight back. I pulled out the chair and sat again, the crack in the china cup still glinting faintly in the afternoon light. My fingers traced it one more time. The fracture had been there for years, but I had refused to throw it away. Now I understood. Some breaks never heal, they only remind you of what was lost. I sat in that stillness, breathing the damp Seattle air drifting in through the open window, and listened to the sound of my own heart finding a new rhythm. I picked up my phone and tapped the screen, trying to steady my hands, though they still trembled. The familiar blue and white icons appeared, and almost out of habit, I opened Instagram. The feed lit up with photos polished to perfection. Right at the top was V's new post, a glossy shot of a breakfast tray on white linens, croissants, papaya slices, espresso in porcelain cups. The caption floated below with hashtags strung together: luxury, living couple goals, blessed life. I stared at the screen as my chest tightened, the glow of her curated happiness pressing against the raw weight of the empty account I had just seen. I enlarged the photo with my thumb. The coffee was dark and rich, the fruit arranged like a magazine spread. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice reading the caption, thanking those who inspired her daily, speaking as if she had created this life on her own. My name was tagged there, tucked neatly in a line of praise, but the words were hollow. She had not written it for me. She had written it for an audience, for strangers scrolling in bed or on buses, people who would believe the life she painted. My throat ached as the truth settled in. Those images were built on my emergency fund. The perfect light in the photo was paid for by the -$55,000 sitting like a wound in my bank account. I set the phone down on the table and pressed my palms against the surface, trying to ground myself. A faint creak came from the old radiator in the corner. Outside, a plane rose into the cloudy sky. Rob would have known what to say, how to anchor me when the ground shifted. He had been a steady hand in every storm until his heart failed one night in 2018, leaving me with this account and the promise that I would be secure. We had called it our safety net. We never imagined our own son and his wife would unravel it, thread by thread. I lifted the phone again and scrolled through more of V's posts. Each square was a scene of comfort and affluence. Candlelit dinners, silk robes, yoga poses on balconies. Her face tilted perfectly toward the light, eyes closed, as if she were absorbing peace itself. The captions spoke of gratitude, abundance, manifesting dreams. I could almost hear her soft influencer tone. My jaw tightened. Gratitude, but never to the one who had made it possible. Abundance, but from a well she did not dig. Dreams, but financed by money meant to save me in crisis. The knot in my chest pressed harder. I remembered Rob's laugh the day we chose the teacup set for our anniversary. He had joked that the china would last longer than we would. The cup still sat in my kitchen cabinet, cracked but whole a survivor. Unlike my savings, unlike the trust I had given too easily. A sound from the hallway made me turn. V had come back, her voice trailing into the apartment as she carried bags from a local boutique. She set them down near the couch, humming lightly to herself. She caught sight of me at the table and smiled in that practiced way. I forced myself to nod my throat too tight to form words. She began pulling out clothes, holding a silk dress against her body and stepping back to look at her reflection in the darkened TV screen. "Do you like this one, May?" She asked lightly, though she did not wait for an answer before moving on to the next item. I swallowed hard. "It looks nice," I murmured, my voice low. She beamed as if I had given her a standing ovation. My stomach twisted. I excused myself and went into my bedroom, shutting the door quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the phone again. The screen was still lit with V's breakfast post, the likes climbing by the minute. Hundreds of tiny hearts accumulating, strangers praising her life, her choices, her shine. They did not know they were applauding theft. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, memories washing over me. Rob and I had worked extra shifts, saved bonuses, skipped vacations, telling ourselves that the emergency fund was more important than indulgence. We imagined it would carry me through medical needs, unexpected repairs, maybe even help Jay if he fell on hard times. It was never meant for a resort on the other side of the world, never for staged photos curated for approval. A message notification appeared. Another post by V. This time, a short clip of her twirling in that silk dress she had just bought, the caption reading "Manifesting Magic Every Day." Music floated in the background, upbeat and soft. My chest ached as I watched. Magic was not what I saw. I saw my savings evaporating into pixels. I turned the phone face down and stood pacing the room. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I needed to breathe, to think, to understand the extent of what had been done. I went back to the laptop, opened the transactions again, tracing each line. The numbers lined up with her posts. The day she had shared a story of champagne on a balcony, there was a charge from the travel agency. The day she filmed herself meditating with ocean waves behind her, there was the airfare. The pieces locked together like gears. I heard the faint laughter from the living room. Jay had come home. Their voices intertwined, light and casual, talking about lighting setups for her next shoot. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them from behind. Jay's shoulders hunched, his eyes avoiding mine, even when he sensed me there. V's hand brushed his arm as she scrolled through her phone. I stepped back before they noticed and returned to my room. I sat at the desk, pulled out a notebook, and began writing down dates and amounts. Each transaction, each caption, each story. My handwriting shook, but the words were steady. I needed to see it all in one place. The numbers told the truth, even when the faces in the next room smiled and laughed. By the time I set the pen down, the sun had slipped lower, the room dim with early evening light. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on the cover, breathing slowly. The tea kettle on the stove was still cool, forgotten since the morning. My throat was dry, but I could not bring myself to boil water again. I walked to the window and looked out at the skyline, the clouds heavy over Seattle. Lights flickered on in the apartments across the street. Ordinary families settling into ordinary nights. I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket, the images it carried pressing against me. I turned away from the glass and sat on the bed once more, letting the stillness settle. The red digits of the bank account and the golden glow of her Instagram feed floated side by side in my mind, two realities that could not coexist. I pressed my palms together not in prayer but in restraint. I would not speak yet. I would not confront them yet. But I knew something had shifted in me. The line had been crossed and I could no longer look away. I rose from the bed and crossed to the closet where an old metal box sat wedged between winter coats and blankets. My hands lingered on the cool steel before pulling it out. I had not opened it in years. The lock clicked open with more effort than I remembered, and inside lay the layers of my past. Files, a small USB drive, and envelopes marked with Rob's careful handwriting. He had insisted we keep everything organized, every document ready so that if anything happened, I would never feel lost. I carried the box to the desk and placed it down slowly. The air in the room felt heavier as I lifted out one folder at a time. My fingers traced my own name printed neatly on an authorization form, a financial access agreement. I studied the signature at the bottom, and a sharp chill passed through me. The signature looked like mine, but the tail of the E in Collins curved inward, a detail I had trained myself out of years ago. I knew instantly it was not mine. It was scanned, forged, pulled from some older document Jay must have seen. My stomach turned. I dug deeper and pulled out the printouts of account access logs. The lines of numbers and times stretched across the page. Each transaction was marked between 2 and 4 in the morning. Small amounts chipped away over the course of 3 weeks, each one just below the threshold that would have triggered alerts. I pressed my palm against my forehead. This was not careless spending. This was deliberate, methodical. Whoever had done this knew how to bypass attention. I leaned back in the chair and let the papers fall onto the desk. Jay's voice from years ago came back to me. He had said he wanted to help after Rob died. He had said linking his name to the account would keep me safe in case of emergencies. I remembered the way I felt then, comforted by his offer, proud of the man I thought he had become. Now that very gesture had become a trap, one I had helped build. I picked up the USB drive, the one Jay had configured for me when he insisted my old laptop was unreliable. I plugged it into the computer, the screen flickering before pulling up archived files. The records unfolded, each more damning than the last. Digital authorization forms, activity logs, transaction confirmations all tied neatly together. Each file a breadcrumb leading back to my own son. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing closer. I could hear the faint laughter from the living room where V scrolled through her phone, oblivious. My heart thudded hard but steady. The betrayal was no longer a shadow in my mind. It was ink on paper, code on a screen, a forged signature pretending to be mine. I stood and paced the room, clutching one of the documents. The memory of Jay as a boy returned uninvited. He was 8, sitting at the kitchen table with Rob, carefully gluing the wings on a model airplane. His hair had fallen into his eyes, and he brushed it back with the same impatient gesture he still used as an adult. Rob had laughed, telling him to take his time, precision mattered. That boy had been eager, curious, gentle. I closed my eyes and felt the sting behind them. Somewhere along the way, that boy had hardened into someone who could watch me smile and still strip away my safety net in silence. I returned to the desk and gathered the papers into a neat stack. My hands steadied as I placed them back into the box. The act of organizing them gave me a strange calm, as if each page was no longer a wound, but a piece of evidence. Evidence of a truth I could not ignore. The radiator hissed and clicked. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on. I sat in the chair and let the silence settle my thoughts, running in measured beats. This was not just about V's vanity or Jay's weakness. It was about my own willingness to believe that love alone could keep boundaries intact. The doorknob rattled lightly as Jay's voice called through the wood, low and casual, asking if I wanted dinner. My throat tightened. "Not now," I said, keeping my voice even. The footsteps retreated, muffled conversation following with V's higher tone. I sat in the quiet after the papers still spread out like a map of betrayal. I picked up my pen and began writing in my notebook. Dates, amounts, times every detail copied carefully. The act felt like reclaiming control, each line of ink a declaration that I would not let this vanish into shadows. The more I wrote, the more the fog lifted. This was not confusion. This was clarity. When I finished, I closed the notebook and laid the pen across the top. My hands folded over the cover and I drew in a slow breath. The apartment was quiet again, only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rush of cars from the street below. I looked at the metal box, closed but not hidden anymore. It would not go back into the closet to gather dust. It would stay here in the open, a reminder of the truth I had uncovered. I rose from the chair and carried the box back to the shelf, setting it down firmly. My legs felt heavy, my chest tight, but my mind clear. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, the faint glow of the city seeping in through the blinds. The papers, the forged signature, the logs of sleepless nights, they would wait for me. For now, I needed to breathe, to let the silence cradle me, to prepare for what would come next. The next evening, I walked into the living room and found V perched on the couch with her phone tilted at just the right angle. The ring light cast a soft glow on her face as she adjusted the hem of her silk robe, pouted briefly, then smiled as if she had discovered joy itself. Jay sat at the far end of the couch with his laptop open, his eyes locked on the screen. His shoulders were hunched, and every so often he scrolled without focus, as if staring at work emails that he had no intention of answering. The air felt thick, almost too heavy to breathe. I stood near the kitchen island and watched for a moment, unseen, or at least unacknowledged. V laughed lightly at something on her screen, then tapped to record a short video. She lifted a cup of tea to her lips, tilting it so the camera could catch the steam, her voice soft and melodic as she thanked her followers for being part of her wellness journey. When she set the cup down, she glanced briefly at me, her smile still in place, though her eyes remained distant. Jay finally looked up, only to drop his gaze the instant our eyes met. He shifted in his seat and rubbed the back of his neck, pretending to type something before closing the laptop altogether. That tiny gesture, the refusal to hold my gaze, felt louder than any confession. Dinner that night was quiet. I cooked a simple meal of rice and vegetables, something Rob used to like, though neither Jay nor V noticed the familiarity. We sat at the small table, plates in front of us, the only sound the clink of utensils. V kept her phone beside her, the screen lighting up every few minutes with hearts and comments. She glanced down at it more often than at her food. Jay ate slowly, avoiding conversation, chewing like each bite required concentration. "Would you like some tea?" Maeve asked suddenly, her tone bright, almost rehearsed. She stood and moved toward the kettle without waiting for my reply. I hesitated before answering with a short yes. My voice came out flat. She poured the tea and set it in front of me, her smile fixed. I nodded once and took the cup. The warmth of the porcelain did not comfort me. It only reminded me of how practiced her gestures had become, how every move seemed designed for an audience, whether real or imagined. The silence stretched only broken when V began talking about a possible brand partnership, speaking in vague terms about wellness retreats and lifestyle content. Jay nodded occasionally, but his eyes remained lowered. I watched him closely, searching for a flicker of recognition, a spark of guilt. Instead, I saw a man shrinking further into himself, unable or unwilling to speak the truth. I set down my fork and folded my hands together. My gaze lingered on Jay. He glanced up for a fraction of a second, then quickly dropped his eyes back to the table. That avoidance was an answer in itself. He knew. He carried it in the tightness of his jaw, in the restless shifting of his hands, in the silence that clung to him like a shadow. V broke the tension with another cheerful comment about the Maldives, already discussing outfits and lighting for photographs, as if the trip were a professional assignment. I watched her lips move, her voice bright and sure, but all I could hear was the hollow echo of numbers disappearing from my account. The meal ended quickly. V carried her plate to the sink, humming softly, her phone still in her other hand. Jay rose without a word and set his plate beside hers, then retreated to the couch. I stayed at the table, staring at the tea I had barely touched. The steam had faded, leaving only the faint scent of leaves and cooling water. I tried to find my breath, tried to hold myself steady. In that moment, the apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage with V as the performer, Jay as the silent accomplice, and me as the unwilling audience. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, every second pressing down harder. V returned to the couch, sitting close to Jay, showing him something on her screen. He nodded once, forced a half smile, then looked away again. I rose slowly, gathering my plate, and carried it to the sink. The clatter of ceramic against porcelain was louder than it should have been. Neither of them looked up. I dried my hands on a towel and turned back toward the table. Jay shifted as if he felt my eyes on him. For a brief moment, his gaze flickered to mine. There it was, that same boyish expression I remembered, caught between fear and shame. Then he dropped his eyes again, shoulders tightening. The connection broke as quickly as it came. I stood there in the heavy silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where conversation should have been. The truth had already settled between us, unspoken but undeniable. Each minute stretched, the weight of it pressing against my chest. The apartment carried on with the ordinary sounds of life, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. I walked slowly back to my room, the voices from the living room fading into a low murmur. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me. The tea on the table outside would grow cold, but I did not care. My body ached with the heaviness of what I now knew. The distance between us was no longer measured in words, but in trust that had been broken and could not be repaired. The next morning I called Mo. My fingers hesitated over the numbers before pressing dial. She picked up quickly, her voice steady, the same voice I remembered from long hours in compliance meetings when every detail mattered. I asked if she had time for coffee, and she agreed without questions. By late afternoon, I was standing outside a small cafe near Pike Place Market, the kind of place with worn wooden tables and the scent of roasted beans clinging to the walls. She arrived early, hair pulled tight, blazer pressed sharp. When she saw me, she smiled with her eyes more than her mouth, then pulled me into a brief hug before we settled into a corner table by the window. I carried the metal box and my notebook, setting them between us. My hands felt clammy against the leather cover. I slid the folder across to her without speaking. She opened it carefully, scanning each page once, then again her brows furrowing as she traced the forged signature with her fingertip. She reached for her glasses and leaned closer, reading the timestamp at the bottom. "This was not casual," she said quietly. "This was deliberate." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. She moved to the access logs, the series of small withdrawals made in the hours most people slept. She shook her head slowly. "This pattern is common in internal fraud cases," she explained, "just under alert thresholds, spread out over weeks to avoid detection." My stomach tightened. She turned to her laptop, tapping keys, quickly pulling up templates I remembered from our FAA days. She compared the sequence codes, pointing out how the submission came from a remote device, not in person. Then she paused, her eyes narrowing. "This code," she said, "is the same system Jay used in his early job when handling vendor authorizations. He knew what would pass undetected." My hand gripped the edge of the table. I wanted to protest, to defend him, but the evidence lay flat between us, undeniable. Mo reached into her bag and pulled out a set of printouts. I noticed the glossy paper immediately. She laid down 2 sheets side by side. On one, a transaction log showing a payment to the luxury travel agency. On the other, a screenshot of V's Instagram post from the same date, a photo of champagne glasses clinking against a turquoise ocean. The images stabbed at me. The smile on V's face, the golden glow of the setting sun, her caption about gratitude and manifesting abundance. Underneath, hundreds of comments praising her glow, her lifestyle, her luck. My eyes dropped to the log beside it, the red numbers draining my account. It was the same day, the same moment, 2 worlds colliding. Mo laid out more sheets. A story of V twirling in a linen jumpsuit matched against airfare charges. A video of her lounging with papaya and espresso timed with the villa booking. Every post had its shadow, every celebration its cost to me. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself not to break down in the middle of that cafe. She looked at me, her gaze firm. "You have to document everything. Do not confront them yet. Gather the full chain," she said. Her pen moved quickly as she sketched a chain of custody map on a yellow pad, arrows connecting files, dates, logs, posts. Each line cut through the fog that had clouded me for days. I nodded slowly, my breath shaky but steadying with each word she spoke. She reminded me to back up files on an external drive, to print multiple copies, to use secure messaging for any notes I sent. She gave me the name of a legal advisor in Bellevue who specialized in elder financial exploitation. As she spoke, I stared at the evidence on the table. V's face beaming from glossy photos, hashtags glowing with joy while my bank logs bled beside them. It was like looking at 2 mirrors. One reflecting the life she wanted the world to believe, the other reflecting the truth I could no longer ignore. The hum of the espresso machine filled the pause. Outside, tourists moved along the street, bags of flowers and fresh fish swinging from their arms, unaware of the storm sitting at this corner table. I lifted my cup and took a sip of coffee that had gone cold. Mo reached across and placed her hand briefly over mine. "You are not alone in this," she said simply. Her grip was firm, steady, then she released. I nodded again, grateful for her presence, for the way she cut through my shame and named it for what it was. Not weakness, not paranoia, but evidence of fraud. We spent another hour aligning documents. She tucked the Instagram prints back into a folder marked with sticky notes. She asked if I had kept the old laptop Jay once set up for me. I said yes. She smiled faintly and said it might help establish the first breach a timeline that showed how long this had been happening. Her efficiency comforted me, reminding me of the days when I could dissect risk with the same precision. When the folders were closed and the notes packed away, Mose stood. She looked at me directly. "Do not speak to them yet," she repeated. "Let the evidence breathe first, then decide what to do." I promised I would. We walked out together into the cool Seattle air. The sky hung gray and low, the faint smell of salt water drifting from the bay. Mo squeezed my shoulder before heading toward her car. I watched her go, then held the folder tight against my chest. As I walked toward the bus stop, the weight of the papers did not feel like burden. They felt like armor. Each log, each forged line, each glossy post tied to a disappearing dollar, all of it now documented. The sting of betrayal remained sharp and unyielding, but for the first time since that morning with the tea kettle, I felt something else too. Not rage, not despair. Clarity. When I reached home, the apartment was quiet. V's ring light still stood in the corner unlit, now her props scattered across the coffee table. Jay's laptop bag rested against the couch. I slipped past both, holding the folder close, and retreated into my room. I placed the documents in the metal box and locked it again, sliding the key into my pocket. I sat at the desk and opened my notebook. With careful strokes, I added Mo's notes to my own, circling the words she had spoken. This was deliberate. I underlined them twice. Then I closed the book and let my hands rest on its cover, breathing slowly. The house murmured with faint sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the shuffle of footsteps down the hall. I stayed in the dim light, steady now, knowing that the truth was no longer just mine to bear. It was written, printed, and ready. 2 days later, I walked into the downtown branch of my bank with the folder tucked firmly under my arm. The marble lobby smelled faintly of polish and paper, the air cool and dry. A receptionist directed me to a smaller office in the back where a man in a gray suit introduced himself as Daniel, a senior fraud officer. His handshake was brisk, his eyes steady but cautious, the way someone looks when they expect trouble behind every account number. I laid the folder on his desk and slid it across. He opened it without comment, flipping through each page, his brow furrowing deeper as he went. He paused over the forged signature, tapping his pen against the curve of the E in Collins. He set it aside and moved to the access logs, his fingers tracing the timestamps. He glanced up at me. "These are all between 2 and 4 in the morning." He turned back to the papers. "That alone tells me this was structured." My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to nod. He opened his laptop and began pulling up the internal system. The screen reflected in his glasses as he typed in routing numbers and authorization codes. After a moment, he leaned back slightly. The transactions were split deliberately, he said, each one just under the alert threshold. "This is a common pattern in elder financial abuse cases." The words hit me harder than I expected. Elder financial abuse. To hear it named aloud made it real in a way the numbers on the screen never had. My hand curled into a fist against my lap. I kept my voice steady. "My son has access. He helped me set up this account after my husband passed." Daniel nodded once, his mouth a thin line, and returned to the screen. He scrolled further down the log, then stopped. His eyes narrowed. "That is interesting." I leaned forward. "What?" He pointed to 2 entries. There were attempts to reverse 2 of the transfers, both flagged and blocked by our system. He clicked to expand the details. The attempts came from the same device that authorized the withdrawals. He looked at me again. Whoever did this tried to push money back, but failed. My chest tightened. For a moment, the office blurred. Jay. It had to be Jay. He had not only taken the money, but tried in secret to return a piece of it. My breath caught between anger and something softer, something I did not want to name. A flicker of conscience too late and too small. Daniel printed the entries and slid the papers to me. "Keep these for your records," he said. He explained the next steps, what could be filed, what investigations could follow. He reminded me that cases like this were complex, that families often tore themselves apart over less. His voice softened slightly when he said, "You have done the right thing by coming here early." I folded the papers carefully and placed them in the folder with the rest. My fingers shook as I closed the clasp. The office clock ticked steadily, indifferent to the storm in my chest. As I stood to leave, Daniel added, "Make sure you protect your digital access. Change everything. Do not let anyone log in except you." His tone was firm, final. I nodded, thanked him, and walked out into the cool Seattle air. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, buses hissing at stops, tourists clutching maps, office workers clutching coffee. I stood on the sidewalk holding the folder tight against my chest, the sound of Daniel's words echoing. Elder financial abuse. Attempts to reverse. The phrases tangled in my mind, pulling me in two directions. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the passing gray water of Elliott Bay. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, the silver in my hair, sharper the lines around my mouth, deeper. I thought of Rob and the way he used to steady me with a hand on my back, his voice calm when turbulence hit. I had no such hand now. I had only papers, logs, and the truth carved into them. When I reached the apartment, the lights inside were already on. I stepped through the door and heard V's voice floating from the living room, bright and sing-song, filming another short video. Jay sat beside her, silent, scrolling on his phone. Neither of them looked up when I entered. I carried the folder into my room and shut the door quietly. I set it on the desk and opened it again, laying the new papers on top. My eyes traced the lines showing those failed reversals. I whispered the times under my breath, the dates, the hours. 2 a.m, 3 a.m. I imagined Jay sitting in the dark, tapping at a keyboard, trying to undo what he had done, the system rejecting him each time. My chest ached with the weight of it. I closed the folder and placed both hands flat on its cover. The silence in my room pressed tight against me, but inside that silence something settled. I had more than suspicion now. I had evidence layered on evidence. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was written in ink, printed in logs, and held in my hands. The muffled laughter from the living room seeped through the door, sharp and hollow. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the locked metal box in the corner. The choice of what to do next loomed ahead, but for now I sat still, letting the sound fade, letting the weight of the papers remind me of what I carried. I carried the folder back into my room and placed it on the desk, but I could not shake the weight of what Daniel had shown me. The image of those 2 failed reversals clung to my thoughts like a shadow that would not lift. Jay had tried, even if only briefly, to undo part of what he had done. It did not change the betrayal, it did not restore the money, but it complicated the shape of his silence. For hours I sat at the desk with the lamp burning low, staring at the papers, running my fingers over the ink, as if the truth might soften if I touched it long enough. By the following evening I knew what I had to do. I pulled the printer from the shelf and began feeding it page after page. The hum filled the apartment, each sheet sliding out warm, smelling faintly of toner, each one a fragment of betrayal made permanent. I stacked them in order, pressed the edges flat against the desk, and slipped them into a thick envelope. My breath steadied with every step. There would be no shouting match, no chaos. Only facts placed in front of the person who had chosen to ignore them. I walked down the hallway, the carpet muted under my steps. Jay's desk sat in the corner of the spare room, cluttered with cords and notebooks, the faint glow of his monitor still on. I laid the envelope squarely on top my hand, resting on it for a moment, then turned away. I did not need to write a note. The truth inside was louder than anything I could say. Hours passed before the sound came. A chair scraping the rustle of paper, the low exhale of someone realizing the walls had closed in. I opened my door slightly and saw him standing under the dim light. He had slit the envelope open and spread the pages out across the desk. His face was drained, the healthy flush gone, his jaw slack, as he scanned line after line. His fingers trembled as he reached the forged signature. He pressed his thumb over the curve of the E, then pulled it back as if the ink burned him. I stepped into the doorway. His head snapped up, eyes wide, the papers shaking in his grip. I moved closer until we stood only a few feet apart. My voice was calm, the calm of someone who has nothing left to lose. Instagram life of V was built on my $55,000 emergency fund. The words landed heavy between us. His lips parted, but no sound followed. He looked at me, then down at the papers, then back again, searching for an escape that did not exist. The silence pressed until it felt like the walls themselves were listening. "You knew," I said softly. "You knew, and you stayed silent." He shook his head, his shoulders sagging, his voice breaking into a whisper. I did not know what to do. She kept pushing, she kept spending, and I could not stop it. His hand rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit from childhood that I had not seen in years. "I tried," he said quickly, his eyes desperate. "I tried to fix it. I tried to put money back. The system blocked me. The mention of those failed reversals pierced me not with relief, but with deeper ache. It confirmed Daniel's words. It confirmed that Jay had sat alone in the dark, trying to undo pieces of the theft, but only after he had already let it happen. I let the silence stretch until he shifted under its weight. "Temporary does not erase deliberate," I told him. "Investment does not excuse theft." He winced, lowering his eyes. "I believed her," he whispered. "She said it was just until the sponsorship cleared. She said no one would be hurt." His voice cracked. "I wanted to believe her." "You wanted to believe her because it was easier than facing me," I replied. His eyes filled with something raw, but no apology came. He gripped the pages tighter, the edges curling under his fingers. I thought of the boy who once pressed flowers into my hands after school, the boy Rob had taught to ride a bike, the boy who once cried when his model airplane broke. I searched for him in the man standing before me, but all I saw was distance. He took a shallow breath. "I am sorry, Mom." The words barely audible, more air than sound. But they were hollow, brittle, without weight. I shook my head. "Sorry is not enough. You let her build a life for strangers to admire while you watched me lose everything Rob and I built." He swallowed hard, his throat working, but he said nothing more. His silence was answer enough. I turned away, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, the simple act grounding me. I sipped slowly, feeling the coolness slide down my throat. When I walked back, he was still in the hallway, papers in his hands, his face pale and drawn. For the first time in days, I felt steady. I looked at him one last time and spoke quietly. I will not scream. I will not beg. I will not carry this silence for you anymore. The damage is not only done, it is documented. He stood frozen, his chest rising and falling too quickly, eyes fixed on me as if he wanted to say more but could not. I let the quiet stretch, then walked past him into my room. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sounds of the apartment. Inside, I set the glass of water on the desk and sat down. My hands rested on my lap, still and calm. The evidence had been placed where it belonged. The silence had been broken. What came next would unfold in its own time, but for now, the night held steady. The following morning, the sound of keys tapping woke me before the sun fully rose. I stayed in my room for a while, listening to the uneven rhythm, the sharp intake of breath, the muttered curse under V's voice. When I finally stepped into the hallway, she was already sitting at the dining table with her laptop open, the blue glow staining her face. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, a robe slipping off one shoulder, eyes darting left and right across the screen. She slammed her hand on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. They postponed it, she hissed. They postponed the launch. Jay walked in from the kitchen, still in sweatpants, rubbing his forehead. Postponed what, he asked cautiously. The deal she snapped. The wellness campaign, the one that was supposed to pay out this quarter. They wrote it in black and white. Ethical concerns. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Jay's face paled. He opened his mouth, but V was already on her feet, pacing the room, waving her phone like a weapon. "They cannot do this," she shouted. "Do you understand what this means? My image, my reach, everything I have built." She turned on him, eyes burning. "This is because you did not send the updated contract, is it not? I told you to upload it last week." Jay muttered something about deadlines stacking up, about things slipping through. His shoulders sagged as he tried to meet her fury with quiet, but she cut him off again. "You had one job," she said, stabbing the air with her finger. "Keep the back end moving so I can stay visible, and you could not even do that." I stood still in the kitchen doorway, a silent observer. The words hit Jay like blows, and for once he did not deflect them. He pressed his hand against the back of his neck and looked down at the floor. V's phone chimed. She snatched it up and scrolled quickly, her eyes widening. "More emails," she whispered. "They want a revised code of conduct. They want me to sign off on financial transparency." She laughed bitterly, a sound stripped of charm. "This is a witch hunt." Jay tried to speak, to suggest she calm down, but she turned on him again. "If my reputation collapses," she said, "it will be because of you. Do you hear me? Because of you." Minutes later, with her hands trembling, she switched on the ring light, sat back at the table, and tapped record. In an instant, the storm vanished from her face. Her voice lifted into the sugary cadence her followers expected. "Hi, loves," she said brightly. "I just wanted to pop on here and share how grateful I am today, feeling the positive energy sending light out into the world." She smiled, tilting her head to the side, the practiced glow radiating. I leaned against the counter, arms folded, and watched the small numbers ticking in the corner of her screen. At first, a few dozen joined, then a few more, but the flow slowed quickly. The comment feed lagged one heart, then another, long stretches of silence between them. She kept talking, forcing laughter, stretching sentences, repeating words. Her smile trembled at the edges, her voice cracking when no response came. After nearly 15 minutes, she ended the stream, abruptly slamming the phone face down on the table. She pressed her palms to her temples and whispered, "They are pulling away. They can smell weakness." Jay sat motionless, laptop closed in front of him. He looked at her with something like pity or maybe exhaustion. She did not notice. She was already scrolling frantically, muttering about outreach engagement rates content strategy. Her hands shook as she scrolled, her nails scratching against the screen. An hour later, another notification rang. This time the email was longer, more formal. She read it aloud, her voice breaking halfway through. "They want proof of financial records," she said. "They want me to verify everything. Brand manager says without this, the partnership is suspended indefinitely." She threw the phone onto the couch and stood trembling, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. Jay finally spoke. "Maybe it is time to take a break," he said softly. "Maybe you should step back." She spun toward him, eyes blazing. "Step back? Do you even hear yourself? If I step back, I vanish. No one remembers the ones who pause. They move on to the next face, the next perfect story. Do you want that for us?" He opened his mouth but closed it again, his words lost in the air between them. By evening, the tension had not eased. I sat in my room reading when I stumbled upon a small Seattle lifestyle blog. The headline caught my eye. "Is influencer glamour hiding cracks beneath?" My chest tightened as I read. The article outlined V's recent Maldives trip, noting the extravagant details, then hinted at inconsistencies, asking where the funding came from and whether her brand aligned with transparency. It was not national news, not yet, but I knew how quickly whispers could travel. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands resting on its cool cover. Outside my window, the sky had turned a bruised shade of gray, the rain misting against the glass. Inside, the cracks were spreading faster than she could seal them. Through the wall, I heard her voice again, strained and sharp. She rehearsed lines for another video, trying to find the right tone, the right smile. Each attempt ended with her groaning in frustration. Jay offered a suggestion, his voice barely audible, and she snapped back at him with venom. She blamed him for the sponsors, for the silence of her followers, for the blog post. Her words cut deep, and he took them without protest. I walked quietly to the kitchen for water. As I passed the living room, I saw her standing with the ring light casting harsh shadows on her face. Her hair was frizzed, her makeup smudged from tears. She scrolled through comments, jaw-tight, eyes wild. She glanced at me suddenly, forcing a brittle smile. "Just a little hiccup with the brand," she said lightly. "Nothing serious." I held her gaze without speaking. After a moment, I nodded once, then walked to the sink. She turned back to her phone, her fingers trembling. That night, the apartment finally sank into silence. I sat at my desk with the lamp dimmed, listening to the hum of the city and the occasional car hissing through wet streets. The folder lay closed in front of me, the evidence stacked neatly inside. I did not need to open it again. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were showing themselves loud and clear, and no amount of hashtags could cover them. I sat at the desk with the lid of the folder closed and the lamp throwing a small pool of light on the wood. The apartment was quiet for the first time all day. The ring light in the living room was dark. Somewhere down the hall, water ran for a moment, then stopped. I took a breath and opened the top drawer where I kept a stack of plain stationery, smooth and cream-colored, a pack Rob had picked up years ago at a bookstore because he liked the weight of the paper. My hand hovered over it. Then I pulled out one sheet and a blue pen. The pen felt heavy and honest. I wrote the date at the top, slow and careful, then paused with the nib above the paper. The words did not come right away. When they did, they came as images first. Jay at Green Lake, small and serious in a red jacket, tugging at my sleeve while Rob knelt to tie his shoelace. Jay racing along the path while Rob jogged beside him, steady hand ready to catch if he fell. The way they would stop to look at planes crossing the sky, counting seconds between flash and sound. I let those pictures settle on the page in my mind, then I began. I wrote to my son using the name on his birth certificate, each letter shaped with care. I told him I loved the boy he had been the one who saved quarters for a model kit and carried it home like treasure, the boy who would line up crayons by shade and ask me to name each color. I wrote that I would keep that boy safe if I could, that I had always tried to. I told him I remembered the day after Rob died when he stood in my kitchen and said he would make sure I never had to worry. I wrote that I believed him then. I paused and listened. The apartment gave a soft pop as the walls settled. A car hissed past on wet pavement outside. I lowered my eyes again to the paper and kept writing. I described the account that Rob and I had built every month, set aside quietly, not glamorous, not meant for anyone to see. I wrote that the numbers in red were not only money, but hours of our lives. I wrote that the forged signature had cut me in a way no stranger could have because it wore my name while erasing my will. I stopped to flex my fingers, then continued. I wrote that I had seen the attempts to reverse 2 of the transfers. I wrote that I understood what it meant to sit in the dark and try to pull back what should not have been taken. I told him that did not redeem the theft and did not erase the silence. It only told me that a part of him still recognized the line he had crossed. The words came steadier now. I set down that I could not accept the man he had chosen to be. I could not accept a man who watched a wife mold a public life from money meant to keep his mother safe. I could not accept a man who waited until the system pushed back to consider pushing back himself. I told him I would not meet him in the space where denial lived. I wrote that I would not shout and would not plead. I wrote that I would not protect him from the truth and would not carry his silence for him anymore. I told him the evidence existed outside of tears and that it would stand on its own. I wrote that the next steps would be taken with care and with guidance from people who worked in the light. I wrote about Rob. I told Jay that his father had trusted him and had trusted me to protect myself. I wrote that love without boundaries was not love at all, but surrender. I wrote that I had surrendered enough. I told him I missed the boy who pressed flowers into my hand and asked if I would keep them on the windowsill. I told him I could not find that boy in the man who stood silent while my account emptied. My hand cramped, and I shook it gently, then picked up the pen again. I wrote that I was reclaiming what I could. My name, my quiet, my small mornings, measured by tea and breath. I wrote that I would not live under an audience, that I would not measure my value against a camera lens or against a count of hearts on a screen. I told him that the world he lived in prized shine over substance, and that I could not live in that world even at the edges. I described the feeling of sitting in the bank office, the phrase, elder financial abuse pronounced like a diagnosis, and how the words had stripped me of any illusion that what happened was a misunderstanding. I wrote that I had looked at the logs and had placed dates next to captions and had watched the pattern draw itself. I wrote that I had been careful, and because I had been careful, I would not be forced to act out of confusion. I told him that one day he might want to explain, and that if that day came, he should start by naming exactly what he had done without decoration. I told him that I did not know if I could hear it, and that I was not promising to. I wrote that forgiveness was not an obligation and that peace did not depend on receiving it. Mine would not. My pen slowed, and the last lines took shape with a firmness that surprised me. I told him I would always love the child he had been, and that I could not recognize the man he allowed himself to become. I wrote that I hoped for him to find a way back to himself, but that I would not leave my door unlocked while he searched. I told him I wished him enough courage to live without lies. I signed the letter with my full name. Not Mom, not Mother. May Collins, the woman Rob married and the woman who would finish her days on her own feet. I set the pen down and read the page from top to bottom, tracing each sentence as if checking a flight plan before takeoff. Everything I needed to say for now was there. I folded the letter in thirds, with the same neatness I used on official documents years ago. The paper made a clean, soft sound as the edges met. I slid it into a plain envelope and wrote his full name on the front. I did not seal it. I placed it on top of the folder inside the metal box and closed the lid gently. The click of the lock felt final, without being cruel. I turned off the lamp and sat back in the chair. The room was dim except for the city glow filtering through the blinds. From the living room came a dull thud as someone set down a cup too hard. A few moments later, I heard the soft, uneven tread of Jay pacing the hallway. He paused outside my door, and for a long beat, I could hear nothing but his breathing. Then he moved on. I stood and crossed to the window. The street below shone with rain. A bus rolled past, its lights smearing across the wet pavement. In apartments across the way, people cleared dishes, laughed dimmed lights, ordinary endings to ordinary days. I placed my palm against the cool glass. The stillness inside me did not feel like absence. It felt like the center of a compass. I went back to the desk and rested my hand on the box. The letter was not a message to send. It was a marker hammered into the ground that had been shifting beneath my feet. It was my own witness. I let that simple truth settle in my chest. Then I turned out the light completely and let the dark hold. I left the apartment the next Saturday with the folded letter still in the box and my notebook tucked under my arm. The rain had stopped, but the streets were slick shining under the gray Seattle sky. I walked to the library on E Pine where the community group was scheduled to meet. The building smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner the way libraries always did. I followed signs down a side hall until I found a small room with a handwritten note on the door that read, "Senior Skills and Support." Inside chairs had been arranged in a circle. A long table in the corner held a metal coffee urn, a plate of store-bought cookies, and a stack of tissues. A woman with cropped silver hair and wire-framed glasses waved me in. She said her name was Carol and handed me a name sticker. Her smile was gentle but brisk, the kind of kindness that had been practiced long enough to become part of her. I wrote May in black marker and stuck it to my sweater. 2 people were already seated. A tall man with broad shoulders and deep creases around his eyes introduced himself as Will. He said he was 66, retired from an engineering job, and still liked to fix broken radios in his garage. Beside him sat a woman in a navy cardigan who gave her name as Mrs. Green. She said she was 70, a retired teacher, and liked to sit by the door because the chairs there squeaked less. Her voice was firm, but warm, the kind of tone that once kept classrooms in order. Others trickled in, most carrying folders or spiral notebooks. When the circle was full, Carol reminded us the group was confidential. She asked who wanted to begin. Will cleared his throat and leaned forward. He told us about his youngest daughter asking him to co-sign a loan. She had promised to keep up with the payments, but within a year she lost her job and the debt fell on him. He rubbed his hands together as he said it, his voice steady but tired. He said he still loved her, but now he kept his finances locked tighter than before. Mrs. Green spoke next. She told us her stepson had visited her while she was recovering from knee surgery and slipped a stack of papers under her pen. He said it was to make Bill pay easier. She signed fogged by painkillers and only later learned one document gave him broad financial control. She caught it before he used it, but she now kept her purse in a locked drawer and visited her credit union in person for anything significant. She shrugged once and said, "Lesson learned." A woman in a floral scarf wiped her eyes before she even began. She said her son told her privacy did not exist in families that love meant sharing every password. She gave in for a while until she realized he had emptied half her savings. She shook her head slowly as she spoke, ashamed of her own trust. Someone passed her a tissue and she dabbed at her cheeks without apology. As they spoke, I felt my chest loosen. For the first time in months, I was not a lone witness to what had happened to me. The circle of chairs held stories that echoed mine, different in detail but identical in wound. When it came my turn, I hesitated, the words pressing against the roof of my mouth. Then I spoke. I told them I had built an emergency fund with my husband, Rob, that we tucked money away for years, quietly and steadily. I told them I opened the account one morning and saw it in red. I said my daughter-in-law posted photos of papayas and champagne while my son stood by. I explained that the forged signature on the documents carried my name but not my hand. The room stayed quiet but not empty. Heads nodded slowly. Will asked if I had support. I told him yes, an old colleague who worked in compliance had already helped me trace the records, and the bank had confirmed the fraud. He nodded again as if checking a box in his mind. Mrs. Green leaned forward and said she was sorry it happened in my own home, sorry it came from people I should have been able to trust. I surprised myself by sharing the detail about the 2 failed reversals. I said he had tried briefly to put money back, but the system had blocked him. My voice cracked a little at that point, but no one interrupted. Then the words tumbled out, "I have not cried. Not once since it started." I did not want to answer. The silence that followed was soft and steady. You kept your dignity. That is no small thing. The sentence pierced through me. My throat tightened. Before I could stop it, tears slipped down my face quick and hot. I covered my mouth embarrassed, but the tissue box was already in my lap. No one told me to be strong. No one asked me to explain. They just waited. I bent forward and wept my shoulders, shaking the sound raw but clean. It was the first time I had allowed myself to collapse since the numbers turned red. When I caught my breath, I apologized, but Carol shook her head gently. She said we apologize when we break things, not when we mend. A ripple of laughter moved around the room, lightening the air. The hour moved on with practical advice. Will described keeping a sealed envelope at his bank with a list of accounts that required 2 relatives present to access. Mrs. Green said she called her credit union every 6 months to refresh her voice authorization. Carol handed out a 1-page checklist with simple steps, 2-factor authentication, fraud alert numbers, password resets. I folded mine carefully and slid it into my notebook. When the meeting ended, we stacked chairs. Will carried the trash bag out and caught me at the door. He said being blindsided makes you think you should have seen the punch coming, but you cannot blame yourself for trusting family. He told me if I needed help with settings or digital locks, he could walk me through it. Mrs. Green squeezed my hand and said she lived a few blocks away and had soup in her freezer if I ever needed a meal on a tired night. I thanked them both with a voice steadier than before. As I stepped outside, the air smelled of wet cedar and bus exhaust. People hurried by with umbrellas, the city pulsing with its usual rhythm. I looked back once through the library's glass door and saw Carol erasing the whiteboard, returning the room to blank walls and stacked chairs. For a moment, I felt a quiet warmth in my chest, not joy, not triumph, but the relief of being seen. I walked home slowly, the checklist folded in my notebook, a tissue still balled in my coat pocket. At the apartment door, I paused with the key in my hand. On the other side was silence, the kind that could be peace or just a pause before the next storm. I slid the key in and turned it, ready to step back into my own life, no longer alone in carrying it. I met the property manager at a low brick building facing Lake Union. The lobby smelled faintly of pine cleaner and damp concrete, and the windows looked out over the marina where boats bobbed in the gray water. He walked me through a one-bedroom unit on the second floor. The hardwood floors creaked softly, the paint was fresh, and when I opened the window, I could hear gulls cutting across the sky. It was not large, but it felt like air after weeks of stale silence. I signed the lease at his desk, the pen scratching across paper, and he pressed a small set of brass keys into my palm. The weight of them steadied me. Back in the old apartment, I began packing. I moved slowly, lifting each item and asking whether it deserved space in the new place. Most did not. Clothes I had not worn in years went into donation bags. Books I had already read and would not read again were stacked into boxes for the library. I filled trash bags with old receipts, cracked picture frames, pens that no longer wrote. By evening, the bedroom was lined with neat rows of what I would leave behind. What remained was surprisingly little. On the bed, I placed the things I could not let go. The bone china tea set Rob and I bought on our 25th anniversary, wrapped carefully in layers of newspaper. The small flash drive that held copies of every bank log and record. The envelope with the letter I had written folded and unsigned for delivery. I touched each one before placing them into a box, marked fragile. These 3 things felt like the compass points of my life. I was sealing the last box when a knock came at the door. Vi's voice followed, softer than the sharp notes she used on camera. "May, can I come in?" I said nothing, but she stepped through the doorway anyway, barefoot, her hair pulled back in a loose tie. She carried her phone, but the screen was dark, no light, no filter, only the faint shake of her hand. I kept folding clothes into the suitcase. She hovered by the bed, her eyes darting between the bags and the half-packed boxes. "Are you leaving?" she asked. I zipped one side of the suitcase and straightened. "Yes." She moved closer, her voice pitching higher. "Wait, you cannot just walk away. We need to talk about this, about what happened." I finally turned to face her. What happened was theft. Her lips parted. "It was not theft," she said quickly. "It was investment. The trip, the photos, the lifestyle. That is how you build a brand. We were setting the stage. You have to spend money to make money." I placed a sweater into the suitcase and pressed it flat. "It was not your money to spend," I said calmly. "It was my emergency fund. $55,000 meant for safety, not spectacle." Her breath caught. She blinked rapidly as if trying to summon the voice that had charmed thousands online. It would have worked, she insisted. The campaign would have paid out. We just needed to hold on a little longer. I shook my head. No campaign erases fraud. No followers return what was stolen. For the first time since I had known her, her confidence cracked. Her shoulders sagged and she sat heavily on the arm of a chair. She gripped her phone with both hands, but did not turn it on. I thought it was the right thing, she whispered. I thought showing abundance would make it real. Abundance built on lies collapses, I replied. Her face twitched as if the words stung. She looked up at me, then her eyes wet. I never wanted to hurt you, she said. I only wanted us to succeed. You did hurt me, I answered evenly. And you pulled my son with you. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic outside. She pressed her lips together and dropped her gaze to the floor. The ring light in the corner stood dark, tilted slightly like a stage abandoned. I carried the box with the tea set to the door and set it beside the suitcase. She rose quickly, stepping forward, her voice trembling. Please, May, do not go like this. We can fix it. We can show them something else, something bigger. I turned to her, the keys to the new apartment cold in my pocket. This is not about them, I said. It was never about them. It was about me, my husband, the years we built with care. You crossed a line and called it investment. I call it betrayal. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The confidence drained from her face, leaving her bare and uncertain. She wrapped her arms around herself as though the robe she wore could shield her from the truth. For the first time, she looked smaller than the image she had crafted a woman, without the stage lights, unfiltered and unprepared. I pulled the handle of the suitcase upright and stood beside the door. She stared at me, her lips trembling, but she did not step closer. I paused for a moment, looking at her one last time, then turned the knob. The hallway air was cooler, freer. I stepped out the door, closing softly behind me, the click final and clear. The apartment on Lake Union greeted me with quiet, the first night I carried in my suitcase, and the box marked fragile. The walls were bare. The air faintly smelled of fresh paint, and the wood floors creaked with a sound that felt like honesty. I placed the suitcase by the bed and the box on the counter, and I stood in the middle of the small living room, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in months, silence did not mean tension. It meant beginning. The next morning I woke before the sun. The air was cool and the windows fogged slightly with moisture from the lake. I set the kettle on the stove and measured the tea leaves into the ceramic pot I had carried across town. The water reached 198 degrees, the exact number I had used for years, and I poured it slowly, watching the steam curl upward. I sat at the table with the cup warming my palms, the sound of gulls and boat riggings clinking faint in the distance. I pulled out my phone almost out of habit and opened the app that had so often brought me pain. V's profile sat at the top, glittering with curated images of beaches and brunches. Her last caption was crowded with hashtags, the kind of phrases meant to prove a life was worth envying. My thumb hovered over the screen, and in a single motion I pressed unfollow. The page blinked once and vanished from my feed. Peace does not need hashtags, I whispered aloud, setting the phone face down on the table. The words tasted steady, like a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. I looked out the window at the stretch of water shining pale in the early light. Joggers passed along the trail, their footsteps rhythmic. A man tugged his dog back onto the path as it tried to chase ducks. The world moved at a quiet pace, free of pretense. I spent the day unpacking. I stacked the books I had chosen to keep on the shelf, lining them neatly with space between, so I could see each title. I placed Rob's photo by the window, the light striking his smile in the frame. I set the bone china cups above the counter, the crack in the saucer facing upward, a scar I would no longer hide. The flash drive and the sealed envelope I slid into the drawer by the table. When I closed it, the click felt like drawing a line. In the afternoon, Monica knocked on my door. She carried a small plant in a clay pot, rosemary with a sprig of green reaching up as if searching for light. She set it on the counter and looked out the window with me. "The lake is good for you," she said simply. I poured her tea and we sat across from each other without speaking for a while. The silence between us was not heavy. It was a kind of rest. When she left, I walked down to the shoreline. Children skipped rocks across the surface, cheering each time one bounced more than once. A couple held hands, their breath misting in the cool air. The skyline rose across the water, steady and unmoved. I sat on a bench and let the ordinary rhythm soak into me. The sound of water brushing the rocks was more healing than any words I could have forced myself to write. That evening, I lit a lamp and opened my notebook. The page was clean, and I wrote slowly across the top. "Dignity is not given, it is chosen." I pressed the pen harder than usual, the ink dark. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the letter in the drawer. 2 pages, both speaking truths in different ways, sat together like companions. As night fell, I opened the window a crack. The cool air drifted in, carrying the faint scent of water and cedar. I lay in bed and listened to the quiet, the hum of the city distant, the lake lapping against the docks. For the first time, sleep came without the shadow of dread. In the days that followed, I built new rhythms. I walked to the small grocery on the corner and greeted the cashier, who already remembered my name. I visited the library where the community group met, and when Carol asked if I would return, I told her I would. Will showed me how to adjust the settings on my phone for security, and Mrs. Green pressed a jar of homemade soup into my hands. Each gesture, ordinary as it was, reminded me I was not alone. One morning, sitting by the window with my tea, I scrolled past news of brands cracking down on influencers demanding transparency. A small blog had posted again this time with sharper questions about V's curated life. I did not linger. It no longer belonged to me. My peace was here in this small apartment where the only audience was the gulls circling the lake. I thought often of Jay, memories of him as a boy with crayons lined in neat rows or pressing flowers into my hand returned with a sweetness that did not ache as sharply anymore. I did not know if the man he had become would find his way back, but I knew I could not wait for it. The letter in the drawer held that truth for him if he ever sought it. As weeks passed, the apartment filled with small comforts. The plant Monica brought sprouted new leaves. The teacups rested on the shelf waiting for quiet mornings. My notebook grew heavier with lines of reflection not for anyone else to read, just for me. I discovered that peace was not loud. It did not need proof. It lived in the act of choosing stillness after storms. One evening, standing at the window, I whispered again, "Peace does not need hashtags." The words felt lighter this time, less like defiance and more like a vow. And if you are listening now, if you have walked through betrayal or watched trust dissolve under the weight of lies, I want you to remember this. What you keep inside yourself matters more than what was taken. Dignity is not about pride. It is about choosing not to let others define your worth. You can step away from the noise. You can set down the silence you have carried too long. And you can find peace not on a screen, not in numbers, but in the quiet of your own life. If this story has reached you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you are listening from. Subscribe so these stories can continue to find you when you need them. And if you know someone holding pain they cannot name, send this to them. Sometimes the reminder that peace is possible is the first step toward healing. Thank you for listening, and take gentle care.